Hi everyone, I'm Alan Willard, Senior Developer Relations Technical Artist, and I got requested to do a stream because somebody got sick. So I have very little preconceived notion of what I'm going to be doing, so I'm going to play around a bit. One of the things that I've done in the past, just for fun, was using world position offset in a couple of interesting ways to essentially erase things from the world. It started off as just an experiment for like derezzing something, and I realized it could be used for a couple other things. So to begin with, I'm just going to kind of start off. So I've got the base character, the TPP something or other. I forget what his actual name is. Tutorial TPP. So it's a really simple skeletal mesh, using it just because it gives me a roughly human figure. And then I've got a material that I've created but haven't done anything in, and I'm going to replace the material on this character with the one I'm going to create here. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab world position with my quite rattly keyboard here, and no, I don't want to color. So I've got a vector parameter, which is going to give me my we'll call it erase location. This is one rattly thing. Now I'm going to subtract these things from each other and feed that directly into the world position offset. So if I've got my math right, which I think I do, we'll find it in a second, my character is going to disappear. That's because essentially, well, it would also help if I applied this material to said character. There, compiling shaders. If I'm doing this right, he's going to disappear or get really big. Order of operations, possibly? So what I'm trying to do is essentially move all of his vertices to that erase location, and there. So now he's completely vanished, and that's not because he's invisible, it's because he's now all of his vertices are condensed into a single spot. What this really means is that I can control this over time or based on event or whatever, and hello, Shelley.
Hi, this was driving me nuts. I'm sorry.
Okay, something is driving Shelley nuts. And there she goes. Bye, Shelley. So what this means is that we can control this to erase the character, either in a linear fashion or through some fun little procedural thing. Given that I tend to like procedural things, we'll do it that way. So I'm going to break this so I can actually see my character, not have him be invisible. And we'll start setting up the wipe pattern. Since I tend to like doing round things, we'll start with sphere mask, and we'll get the actor position. So this is the actual location in the world that the character is in, and the world position of the pixel. And we're going to compare these two things in the sphere mask. So if I also say set the radius to be 0.5 and drop the hardness to 50% and preview this, we should see a little white dot right in the center. And as my radius increases, my dot will increase. So this is going to become my my wipe pattern for causing my character to erase. So here we'll go ahead and create the or convert this to a parameter, and we'll call it wipe radius. And we'll increase the hardness to, well, let's just go ahead and parameterize it. Wipe hardness. And we'll default it to 0.8, so it's about 80% sharp, so that it's got a bit of feathering to it here, but it's not a totally linear fall off, and it's not a crisp, harsh circle. We can get that later if we really want to. So this is going to give me my mask, and if I just multiply these two things together, well, first I'll hook up to the emissive so you can see it on the character. Now, one thing that's going to happen is, because this is the origin of the character, it's going to start from the feet and go up. So right now, my wipe would happen, it would essentially erase his legs up to his upper thighs, and then if I adjust these values, it would increase or decrease. If I want to adjust this, I can have another vector parameter, and we'll call this actor center offset. We're going to add these two things together, the new vector parameter and the actor position offset. This will give me the ability to change the center point for this calculation. We'll go ahead and just move it up in Z about, let's say, 90 units. You can see it's already moved up. It's now clipping against the primitive here. I'll compile it, and I should see it here in my scene, roughly centered in his body. So now you can see the fall off is a little more reasonable in terms of the coverage on his body. So I'm going to hook this up to my world position offset here, and we'll make this character a little more interesting to look at. We'll get him kind of close to what he was before I started messing with him. Make him roughly orange. Not rough at all. And let's go ahead and make him highly specular, just to make sure. So there we go. Stop previewing, and should go orange. There, cool. Orange plastic with that fall off. So he's going to stretch away as soon as he finishes compiling. So there's kind of in progress what it's looking like. Anywhere that was black is being left alone. Anywhere the shading to white, it's all condensing down to some point in space. Now, that point in space is being defined by the erase location. So if I go and create a material instance of this unzip material and hook this up to my character instead, in my material instance parameter, I can now start changing these values and erase and reveal the character completely. Now again, the parameters for, say, the center offset can be adjusted, so I can say if I really do want them to erase from the feet up, I can do that. Or I could do it the reverse and move it way up and have him erase from the head down. And this can be really good for doing something like a Tron-esque laser construction thing where you see it kind of draw it in depending on what kind of material parameters you have. You'll notice there's some curvature here. That's because of my wipe hardness. The harder this is, the more immediate that erase mechanic is going to come into play. So we can get almost the laser drawing it in look by having it just completely harsh and drawing it in like that. Now, because we're doing this in world position offset, it's vertex based, not per pixel. So a really low resolution mesh or a moderate resolution mesh that's scaled up a lot, so the distance between vertices is pretty great. You're going to see the steps more dramatically. You can see it a little more as I reduce the hardness because there's just not as many verts to interpolate. So you'll see as it gets to especially the thigh, you'll start seeing distinct sharp edges because it can't interpolate where there's no vertices. So, of course, we can continue playing with this. Let me bring my hardness back up into a useful range. There we go. So we can continue playing with this, doing things like, say we want this to be masked and we want it to erase itself, not just to a point, but also fade out before it gets to that point. We can do something pretty similar to what we did before. Another sphere mask, not atmospheric fog color. So we're going to call this the add a scalar parameter and call it erase radius. Let's say at 300 units. And here we're going to set the hardness to a pretty sharp circle. And because I want the same offsets, I'm just going to steal those inputs from the other material up here, or the other section. I want to make sure that I'm getting the exact same radial result. And I'm also going to change my material to be masked. Now, I could do the fade off a number of different ways. I could use this directly, but since I'm not doing translucent, it wouldn't give me a very soft line. I just get a sharp edge where it no longer renders. So if I just hook this up directly, and wait until it kicks in. So if I move this far enough, you can see that erase radius is a sharp-edged line. So however many units away from it is, it's just going to cease to appear at that point, which could be really good if that's what you're going for, but I'm looking for something with a little more softness. Since I'm in masked, I need to leverage temporal anti-aliasing, so I'm going to use the output of this sphere mask as a lookup into the dither temporal anti-aliasing.
Yeah. Can you open up a doc I'm sharing with you because I want to put questions in it?
Yep. Clint is going to put up a, well, I'm not logged into mine.
Oh.
You share it with Alex, I guess?
Can you access Alex's?
I don't know, maybe. I can get to his docs.
Is that on it? Oh, I'll share it with Alex then.
Okay. Sorry, we're getting the filtered list of questions. I did notice that somebody asked if does this affect collision? From the Night Watcher asked, no. This is completely on the rendering side. So we're not actually moving the verts, we're just moving where the renderer thinks the verts are. Slightly different. So.
But I added it on and I'll do my best to add questions. It's just called
Where is it?
questions.
Let me refresh this page. I see it not.
If not, don't worry about it.
Nope. No, I don't see it. Wait, is this it? Nope. Stream questions?
Yeah. I mean, I only have one on it right now, but I'll
Yep. What do I use spec for? I use roughness usually. Okay, so we're back. So someone asked, what do you use spec for? So roughness is the microfaceting of a surface and how much that scatters the light that's hitting it. The less it scatters, the more of a direct reflection of the light you get. This is how you control the overall surface response of a material. You can do this directly, like I did with the value here. You can do it with a map, whatever. If a material is not metal, then you can use the specular input to control the glossiness of the plastic independently of the roughness. So you can, it's essentially, I'm just making sure that my plastic is completely glossy and reflective. If I set the specular to 0, I'll have plastic with no shine to it. So I just get a flat thing. So I'm just explicitly setting it to be extremely specular and glossy and smooth. So somebody asked if you can have multiple origin points that it gets sucked in and out of. You could conceivably change the input. Like if you have a blueprint that says, I'm in my creation state, so I'm going to appear and kind of write myself into the world, and then, okay, I'm done with that state, and now I'm going to change states, and I'm going to be in my destroy or erase state, and in which case you can change the kind of output point. So you're essentially moving from the mask negative state, where the character's not rendering at all, into mask positive, the character's there. You're changing that origin point and then moving back to the mask positive state, in which case it erases to the new location. Inside of my instance material, I can actually change that erase location. And this is world coordinates. It's probably easier to do this inside of a blueprint, but if I change this dramatically, there. So now my erase location is at about 350 units, positive Z and positive X. So it's somewhere off to screen right. And if I increase my erase radius, you can actually see there's the new point at which it's going to erase to. And as I move my character around, you can see that erase point is going to stay in world space no matter where my character goes. So if you wanted to erase to a specific point based on the character's position, and you're doing it in a blueprint, you would just get the current location of the player or the actor, offset by wherever your displacement point is going to be, and then set that as your erase location, and that's where everything would get sucked to. So back inside my material, I was talking about doing the opacity dithering. So the alpha threshold is the percentage of dithering that's going to be applied. At 0, you get no dithering. At 1, you get, or at 0, you get, there's no pixels that are positive, and at 1, you get all your pixels are opaque. So by using this as my opacity mask input and feeding my sphere mask results into my dithering, I'll get a soft fall off. I may need to invert it, but and I'll set my erase radius back. So now when I look at it, I've got a soft fall off because the noise pattern that you see moving around here is being applied every frame. The temporal anti-aliasing is then averaging those results. The outline doesn't have that applied though, so you see it briefly. But now I have what looks like an opaque character that's fading out as this erase occurs. And I can, of course, change that. And depending on how I was doing it, I could be much more aggressive with the erase line, or I could be much less, so it was a softer look, however I wanted to. So there you get that kind of dithered erasing. If I was doing this in-game, it would look a little more smoother, because whenever I'm manipulating my material instance, it's interrupting temporal anti-aliasing until I let go. So you see the dither pattern. I unclick the mouse and everything gets nicely smooth again. And obviously inside of my material, I could do more. I could say, I'm going to use this this wipe result, the sphere mask, seal it, and say we're going to have an erase effect. We're just going to multiply these together and put it directly into the emissive channel. So now, if I wanted to have like a burn away look, I could go in and set my erase effect to be some dramatically strong color. It would help if I actually gave it a valid color, not just clicked OK. And we'll say we'll increase the value by a factor of 10. So now when I erase, you actually see a bit of that happening on the character in that circle. So you start to actually get some burn away. Of course, I can increase this even more. Now, obviously, I could go in and begin modulating this result so that there was some noise to it or some texture going on. But if I just wanted to burn him away, I can get that pretty easily. And he's gone. So this is one of the things that I've discovered you can do kind of per object. If I was going to do this more globally, instead of using static parameters like I've done here, where I've got scalar and vector parameters that I've written in directly, I could do it in a much more general sense. I could either make my erase mechanic a material function and just pass it in any material I wanted. Or more likely what I would do is use a material parameter collection and combine that with the function that I was talking about, and then have the material parameter collection drive all the materials simultaneously. Somebody asked, can this be done with other kinds of anti-aliasing like FXAA and SMAA? You can. The dithering is not going to be soft, though. The temporal AA is what kind of averages the results of the pixels over a period of time, hence the temporal part of the name. FXAA and SMAA would give a different result. There'd be a little bit of softness to the edges, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't quite work the same. Somebody asked, can I make the character disappear whilst he's moving? Sure. There's absolutely nothing going on here that isn't totally doable at runtime with an animation and what have you. I don't have him set up to animate. I created this from the base template, not like the first person template, but yes, you could totally set this up so that as he's moving. Now, it would, because what I'm doing here is based on a point in space and comparing that point in space to where the polys of the mesh are, it would, like say his arm swung down to his thigh, his arm would start to disappear as well. It's not going based off of his anatomy at all. If I wanted to do that, I would do something based on a texture mask on the character. So having something like a gradient that moved out from the character and followed the contours of his body, and then using that as the determining factor for which parts of his body should be visible or not. And we've done things like that before, D-res effects, where we have a gradient or a mask that kind of eats away at the character based on what's going on. We've done stuff like that in UT for burning or acid or things like that. So for this particular effect, you could use the same techniques of having a texture mask instead of my sphere mask here, and then just clamping and moving those values to determine which parts of the mesh should be visible or not. Now, I mentioned doing things with a global parameter system, and the nice thing with that is that, and I'll create one now, material parameter collections, erase collection, and I'm going to put 2 parameters in here. Erase amount and erase position. So now inside of my material, instead of the vector location that I had here, I'm going to use a collection parameter, and I'm going to, there's only one currently, or that's the first one it found, and I'm going to choose erase position. From having done things with this before, I know this is a float 4 by default, and I only want it to be 3, so I'm going to mask it down to just 3, and I'm going to replace this subtract, or this input. So now any material using this, or any instance of this material anywhere is going to get that value from this object, not from any particular material instance. Can you explain the difference between texture coordinates in the editor viewport and in standalone? There seems to be some cropping in the viewport. By texture coordinates, do you mean the screen position node, or the UV coordinates of the window, or the coordinates of some particular object in the scene? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there. Hopefully I'll get some clarity on that. I'll go back to talking about this until I do. So I've got my erase position and the mask, and we've got the wipe radius. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to grab the erase amount, knowing that this is, I could do some massaging so that these values were in a bit of a different range, but this will work for my current implementation. So now I've got this unzip instance. I can start applying this to all of the objects in my scene. I'll create a new material instance. Blue, which is not actually blue yet. How does somebody just asked, how does the texture mask for erasing the character based on anatomy, what should it look like? Essentially, it would be a set of linear gradients that followed the unwrap of the character. This character isn't unwrapped in that fashion. You'd either want a second UV channel that is unwrapped in a particular way, so that you think something like the Vitruvian Man, the arms out, legs out character. You could do something like that and then have just a gradient mask that goes like that. That way you know that your arm, the pixels that represent your arm, are never overlapping another part of your body. And then you can just have a really simple gradient that you use that way. You could do something more complicated where you have like one arm receive it before another, or the legs first, or something like that, by just changing the pixel values on different parts of the body. I'm not doing that here, so it's not really relevant, but it wouldn't be very difficult to play around with different gradient masks and see what they're coming out with. I'm going to change the color on my material to a parameter so that my material instance blue can actually be blue. There we go. And once it finishes compiling, I've got a blue chair and orange desk and so on. Now, in my parameter collection, my erase amount is affecting everything simultaneously. So I no longer have to interact with the individual objects. For the most part, you wouldn't use this for independent objects like this in a scene, but if you had something more complicated, like a car or a building or something like that, where you wanted to erase the whole thing and it's all made of different parts, then you could do something like this very easily, where everything just disappears simultaneously. Now, my erase position for all of this is going to that point in space. So I can change my erase position. Let's do it like this. So let's say I want to move Z up a ways, and I'll move along X quite a ways away. So now everything is erasing all at once and out. So this lets me have a globally defined position that everything's going to vanish to, but the actual erasing is going to happen based on the location and coordinate set for the individual objects. You'll notice that each of these objects is erasing roughly from the center, because I'm doing that in the calculation in the material, not doing it globally here, but the point that they're all streaking off to in whatever direction is all being driven by the global parameters. Somebody asked, is the erase location world space or object space, and how can you make it the other way around? Right now I'm doing it in world space. That's because inside of the material itself, and I can open this up, my calculation is being done here. So I'm subtracting a point in space from world position. I could do it in object position, but that would put it all in object space. So basically I'm saying wherever this point is in world space is my origin for the erasing. If I did this as object, then it would subtract to the legs of the character, or the feet. So just to show what that looks like. Compile. Now because this is assuming world position, my global parameter collection, all of my objects are going to go to different places because it'll all be relative to themselves. It's all still stretching way off. You can see there's some similarities to where they're going, but it's not quite identical. So you can do quite a lot of things with it, depending on what coordinate set you're in, but most of what I'm doing is assuming that the world is where I want to erase things to. Somebody asked, can I use this and make it work in a particle system? Sure, but given that most particles are just quads, your erasing is going to be pretty kind of low curvature to it. The four corners that make up the quad of a sprite are going to all kind of go at once. Somebody asked, how would it look if it's sucked into the center point of itself? Well, if I did basically the same coordinate set, it would just erase into nowhere, basically. If I go into my parameter collection and say increase the erase amount and start adjusting this so that we're erasing roughly to the character's center. It does that. And that is because in my material, my erase radius is large enough that it wasn't ever getting rid of it. So now we'll go back into the collection. Yeah, I'd need to get rid of the erase radius completely. And change this back to row position so that it collapses to a single point instead of the shape of the object at its endpoint. There. So this is what it would look like if it just kind of black holed into itself, which again could be a really fun effect to look like. Now granted, everything else in the scene happens to be erasing to my character's knees as well, but you can kind of see what it would look like if it was just the character erasing. There. I move them far enough that they're no longer rendering in frame, so they disappear. So this allows you to have, that kind of control and erase things all together and have different kind of effects. Question, does the ending sequence of Bullet Train use similar techniques? Can you perhaps show us how to create a simplified version if you have the time? Bullet Train used a whole bunch of different techniques, especially for the end sequence when the robot from the Samaritan demo explodes. He does some stuff like this for the explosion, and then there's a whole lot of material tricks that are going into making the world look kind of digitized and erased and things like that. I'm not going to try and get into that amount of content without having more time to sit down with it and look at how it was built. Somebody asked, when using a mask to erase a double-sided rendered character using opacity, you can see back faces inside the mesh. Is there a way to make back faces use a different color or material? Like if I wanted the inside to be unlit black. So there's a two-sided sign. There's a couple different ways. One, unless your mesh is physically duplicating faces, like you modeled it that way. Think a ball with an inner skin. The normals for the interior surface are flipped. And what that means is that if I go into my material here and set it to be two-sided and look at just the plane, if I look at the vertex normal, I'm previewing it, this will be pretty glowy, but it should show off what I'm talking about. So this is the vertex normal of the surface. It's not rendering on a plane. There. So I'm getting a positive value on one side and a negative value on the other. Well, or I would be if it were actually rendering two-sided. Make this the emissive and skip the rest of the behavior here. Because I'm previewing, it's skipping some of the material property settings. So this, essentially what you're doing is your normals are Z-facing, so the blue channel in most cases is a positive value on the front side of the triangle, and -1 or the unit vector is negative on the other side of the triangle. What that means is that you can test for that. There's actually a two-sided sign that should give you exactly this. So what two-sided sign is doing is it's positive on one side and negative on the other. So you can use this as a mask to say everything on the outer face is going to be where everything on the outward facing is going to be a color, and everything on the inward facing side is going to be black, which is essentially what's going on here. So this would give you that ability to, and we can see it a bit here, on the inside of my character, where the non-emissive behavior would be. We can actually hook this up to specular as well. And we will get black on the inside and white on the outside, because that's what the current emissive values are set to. I can set this to be diffuse or whatever. So now on the inside, we're completely black, wherever the vertex normals are set up correctly. So if you were to start erasing holes in the mesh, this would be how you get, excuse me, black on the inside. Somebody asked how to add a ripple effect at the same time. That's actually pretty easy. All you would need to do is have either like panning the world position with the sign of time or something like that, so that you get ripples. But then you'd add that to your position offset here before multiplying it. So you'd add all of that, ripple behavior right about here, and then feed it in. So for example, this could be I'm going to grab the red, green, and blue channels independently. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the red and green channels of world position, putting them into a panner, so I'm able to just start moving those vectors around, and then putting it back together with the previous blue channel so that I have a 3-vector coordinate again. And so this will add some noise to the calculation. There's a couple of different ways you could continue to enhance that. Right now I'm doing it in where the erase calculation is going, so it's going to have some effect on that, as you can see. You can also just modulate the erase behavior before that. Yeah, because of where I've done it, I've essentially modified my endpoint to some strange location. But yeah, you can essentially, what you're looking at here is an erase location, and then you also want to add in your displacement after this has been done. So I'll go ahead and just hook this back up so that's correct again. So what about making each effect go to each instance's center instead of a unified point in space? Do we have to make for each instance a specific value, or is it possible to detect a center for each object instance and calculate the appropriate position in the material? Yes, you could very easily do that. Let me see if I can remember off the top of my head. So it's been a while since I've done this, but I've got not 1 minute, I want to subtract. I've got the absolute world position and the actor's location, and I'm going to zero those out and use those as my, I'm not even sure if this will work, as my erase position. So this may, if my math is right, which there's absolutely no guarantee, I'm just moving the whole character. Yes, because you can get the position of the character. I guess I could just feed that in. This may work. Yeah, so this should just take it to the origin of itself, like you see here. And again, because the origin for my character is the spot between his feet, there. So everything is now erasing to its pivot point, essentially. You could probably do, in the blueprint, you can calculate the bounds and get the bounds location and pass that in world space. So in blueprints, there's a couple of ways to kind of procedurally add in more detail. Somebody asks, can the sphere mask use the location of a bone as a start point and also tie its radius color to the rotation of said bone? How would one do this? Off the top of my head, you could pass that value in a blueprint. You can say, give me the position of this bone, as long as you know the bone name, and then you can pass that in as the parameter for the erase position. That would affect the whole mesh. So say you wanted to have it condensed down to my hand, and no matter where my hand is, I would have to feed that hand's transform into my material however frequently I want to update it. And then if you wanted to take the rotation value for that bone and transliterate that into some color value, you could do that as well in the blueprint. Is there a way to shatter the mesh inside material, split faces, and move them apart without prepping the model inside a 3D tool? I assume you mean just like exploding the mesh. Only if the mesh has discrete UV seams already. The mesh, the engine basically welds the vertices together if the mesh is smoothed. If it's faceted, that's pretty easily done. Excuse me. If it's done inside of a smoothed mesh, like my character is here, the only places you'd be able to break it are the pre-existing seams. Give me back my diffuse color here. And get rid of the emissive. I think I recall something about Material Editor getting reroute nodes soon. Is that a real thing? I have no idea. I think there was some plan to do it, but it doesn't seem to be in yet. If so, it'll be a future point release of the engine. Somebody also asked, can you erase to the pivot point but make the vertex curve towards the shape of the object instead of going to the erase point via a straight line? Erase to the pivot point, make the vertex curve. So there's a couple different things there. If you mean curve towards the shape of the object, as in moving the whole object in a straight direction, or moving each vertex along a vector rather than to a point, I did that by accident a few minutes ago. You use the world position. I think it was here. It ended up looking something like this, where, yes, you can maintain the vertices' relative offset from each other as they move to the endpoint, if you do it right. I'm not sure if I've got it. I seem to have put it back the way it was before. So yes, it is possible to essentially just move all of the vertices to some point in space. Well, no, I'm moving them very, very far away. I mean, one thing you can do, like I'm doing, if I just did, let's say, I can keep trying different math things here. Eventually something will work. I meant that the vertices are moving to the erase point while being interpolated to the nearest non-erased vertex, so they don't move in a straight line. No, well, I don't know of a way. Not that there's not one. Essentially, we're starting to get further into vector math than I am going with this. So there, yeah. Now I'm just kind of teleporting the whole guy across space to some point. If I were going to do curvature, like if I wanted an intermediate point that, say, vertex leaves object here, goes towards here at its halfway point, and then ends up here, what I would probably have is a multiple step vertex offset where at 50% it's 50% of the way towards some intermediate position, whether it's the character moved somewhat along the line or something like that, to give that appearance of a path that it was following. I mean, there's other ways of doing path deformation and things like that in the engine, but this is kind of how I would do it. If you're just looking for something it's more curvature driven like this, modifying the hardness of that the sphere mask that I'm using to do the wipe gives me that kind of softer look. If I go back into my material and hook this up correctly again, I should get my eased in wipe to some arbitrary point in space, wherever the current erase location is set. There. So now if I go into my erase collection and increase this, I'm still doing the math wrong. But yeah, so this lets you do it more softly. If I increase that hardness, you get the kind of laser writing in look. If I there, this should be right. So there's a number of different ways to use this. Another thing you can do with this is, obviously you can skip the whole sphere mask thing and just use something more along the lines of the texture masking. So if I were to say get actor position, world position, subtract these guys from each other, and divide the results by some value. I only want the blue channel, so I only want a vertical result. I should get a extremely sharp line right there, which you can just barely see through the glow. If I divide this by, say, 300, I'm starting to get a soft look there. And if I vertical mask bias, I can add to that position a little bit. So now I've moved my mask up, and this is all procedurally generated, so vertical mask divide, and set this to be 300 as well. So I'm going to get rid of the sphere mask that's currently controlling my opacity, or my mask, and throw this in instead. And now I can have a purely vertical erase behavior. It's doing some really interestingly funky stuff, because I think my erase math is still wrong. So somebody asked, if you're essentially just moving the vertices of the object to a new point, does collision follow the vertices? No. Again, because this is all being done essentially just on the render side, there's no collision being calculated at all. I bet you I know. I need to... clamp so I'm not getting ridiculously negative values. Because I am doing this procedurally, I'm getting all the values all the time. Does this have the same effect with a destructible mesh? Yes. Any rendering primitive that you can throw a material on, there may be some differences depending on the way that the origin is calculated. For example, a destructible mesh is still a single object even as the pieces go bouncing around, so the individual chunks have no directly accessible transform that you can drive. So if you wanted the whole destructible mesh to kind of erase it once, that would work fine. If you wanted individual chunks to have their own behavior, they're not individual objects. They don't have their own, they're essentially skeletal meshes. So you'd have to do some... You'd have to write a little bit of code to get individual transforms that you could access to be able to manipulate those in that way. There we go. So now we're erasing our objects from the bottom of themselves to the top. Did I get rid of the... No, I didn't. My two-sided sign was still making everything ghostly white. And finish compiling. Come on, you can do it. There we go. So we'll set the color to be something actually useful. Why not green? We have a green robot now. So there we go. And obviously, if I change this mass divide, I get a much sharper edge. This is essentially softening that transform. So now I can have kind of warp out instead of the extremely strong erase. Somebody asked if this is the same for widget and 3D widgets. Two widgets that are done in UMG, probably not, since they don't have a world transform the same way. 3D widgets that are placed in the world probably would. Somebody asked, could you use this method to make a whirlpool effect? Interesting. So with the right vector math, you could probably get something that tries to twist the mesh down. There's a lot of different ways I would prefer to use to make a whirlpool. For example, having a cone shape with actual UVs that spiral in, and then using displacement to having that behavior happen. Since this is happening on the rendering side, what would you recommend for shadows of the object? Just keep them as movable. Yes, that'll work pretty well. Plus, if you're doing masking like this, and you can get rid of the the stretch pretty quickly, you can see that it's working. I'm seeing the shadows on the ground. So if I move this guy here, as he gets erased, you watch the shadow erase as well. That other blob is the little statue that's sitting on the mesh. So yeah, that should work just fine. Obviously, static objects that you do this to, it's not going to update their shadow results, again, because they are static objects. They're not going to update their results the same way. All right, I think that that eats up our entire hour. I hope it was interesting, at least, and somewhat educational. Hopefully the next time I do a Twitch stream, I'll have more than a day to prepare for it. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys have a good week.